college fairs, I visited the tables of over 20 Catholic colleges, and I was struck by some common themes in their materials. In all but 3 of these colleges, the word Catholic never appeared in their materials. And the ones where it did, it was a rather peripheral comment, not a central comment. The college reps freely admitted that their schools no longer prescribe to a Catholic identity or mission. They see little value in it from a marketing perspective. They have adopted a politically correct mission and adapted to the ever-evolving demands of the woke agenda. I must say that even more disappointing than this was that the vast majority of students and families attending these fairs received these marketing messages favorably. It was a frightening view of what has happened to our culture. Now, many of you also may know the rumblings about His Excellency Bishop Strickland of Tyler, Texas, that he's either going to be asked or forced to step down from his diocese because of his criticism of the hierarchy that is also embracing politically correct agendas and the demands of the woke culture. Now, I don't know what's going to happen to Bishop Strickland, but I do know that he stands as a beacon of light in a time of darkness in the church. And standing next to Bishop Strickland spiritually, the Collegium stands as a beacon of light in a higher education landscape that has forgotten the purpose of Catholic higher education, to form young adults to Christ, to be the vehicle by which the next generation of Catholic leaders will pass the beauty, goodness, and truth of the faith to the following generation, the role of tradition. And we do this through a program of academic studies that is anchored on the teachings of Christ, as passed down to us through the apostles, the fathers of the church, the great teachers through the ages, such as Benedict, Aquinas, and others. We do this through a spiritual life that is anchored on the Mass of the ages and the divine office, both of which nurtured the faith of the great teachers of the church and led them to heaven. And we do this in hopes that it will lead us to the same end. We do this through a program of work that teaches our students virtues that will continue to serve them and us, the faculty, in this life as we strive for eternal joy in the next. So in sum, we are a college committed to forming young adults to Christ. We're more concerned about who our students will be and where they will spend eternity than we are with what specific job they will acquire upon graduation. And we do this while trying to keep the cost of the college down. Here we're not so traditional. We're turning upside down the financial model of higher education because it's not sustainable. We're working through collaborations with entities in the city. Our students have a work program. We have income. We do this through income producing auxiliaries, reductions in middle management positions, and a whole lot more to try to keep the tuition affordable for families and to keep the operation sustainable. Now, you might ask, is it working? Well, absolutely. We're not there yet, but the direction is the right one. And God is with us. We will prevail and we will succeed. God is with us and he will help us. And he will use folks like you as his instruments. Now, I want to show you something. Most of you are here because you saw a flyer like this, okay? If you look at this flyer, you'll notice that it says nothing about tonight being a fundraiser. So if your palms are starting to sweat and you think that this is that moment when we break out the pledge cards and everything stops and gets quiet until everybody's completed a pledge card, relax. That's not going to happen tonight, okay? That's not our primary purpose. However, if you're of a mind to support us, we would be remiss to deny you that opportunity. Okay. So in our view books, there are these lovely little envelopes. And if you'd like to write a check and put it in an envelope, we will not stop you from doing that. Or there's a QR code. You can go online and make a donation. And if you don't know what a QR code is, ask one of your relatives that's under 12 years old and they'll walk you through the process. Now, If you're not thinking about or able to provide any kind of financial assistance, you can still help us. Take some of the view books with you and let other people have them. Let people know who might be interested in supporting us, or let people know who might have an interest in being a good fit as a student at the Collegium. Help us get the word out. We're a small operation. We don't have a huge marketing department, and you can help us let people know that we're here. And finally, certainly, you can pray for our success. There's also a little prayer card in the view book. I commend this prayer to you, to the angels under whom we've put our patronage. We pray this every day for the success of the Collegium, and I would ask you to do the same. So that's it. Please enjoy the food, the company, and the events throughout the evening. So take some time, enjoy each other, and the talk will begin in a few minutes. But for right now, just have a good evening. Thank you.
Before I begin, I wanted to thank all of the Arlington and DC Catholics for your awesome witness to all of us at the National Pilgrimage for Summorum Pontificum y'all did last week. So thank you. I'm so happy to be here. Let's give a round of applause for this fantastic organization, the Arlington Mass Society. Okay. Quebec and Maryland. French and Anglo Christendoms of the Americas. In the year 1774 of the reign of our Lord Jesus Christ the King, on October the 14th in the city of Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress of the American Revolution condemned the, quote, establishing the Roman Catholic religion in the province of Quebec, abolishing the equitable system of English laws, and erecting a tyranny there. In fact, this grievance against our Catholic faith actually made it into the Declaration of Independence. Quote, abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government, and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies. That's in the Declaration of Independence, end quote. This free system of English laws were the penal laws against Catholics in England. This was a condemnation of the Catholic culture of Quebec. Why did the revolutionaries condemn Canadian Catholicism? And why, moreover, did the Marylander Catholic Charles Carroll of Carrollton sign this condemnation? And what does all of this have to do with the Collegium? In this talk, I'm going to attempt to show why Maryland matters for American Christendom and why the Collegium matters in Maryland. The colony of Maryland was founded by a Catholic, George Calvert, aka the First Lord Baltimore. He was a pious Catholic who renounced all his political power and publicly professed his Catholic faith in 1625 and made plans to build a colony in the Americas, which would allow the celebration of the Holy Sacrifice freely to the faithful. At that time, the free system of English laws made Holy Mass illegal. Attending an illegal Mass could get you to the death penalty. This illegal Mass was the same ancient Roman rite upon which the Collegium is based, the Latin Mass, and for which the Arlington and DC Catholics marched last week. The plans for the colony of Maryland were carried out by his son Cecil Calvert, aka the Second Lord Baltimore. The legal charter for the colony was named Terra Mariae, which made it named technically after the English king's consort, the Catholic Queen Henrietta Maria. But according to historian Charles Collegium, we may safely assume that the Catholics who founded Maryland also took it to be named after Our Lady. And that is the view I will present here. Thank you. Yes, yes. The Baltimore family were the governors of Maryland, but they stipulated that they would treat their Protestant colonists with kindness, and the practice of the Catholic faith would not be forced upon them in any way, as it was in England the opposite way. When they landed on one of the unclaimed islands of the Potomac on the Feast of the Annunciation, Jesuit Father Andrew Wright sung High Mass on the island and named it after Pope St. Clement, the patron saint of mariners. As a result, the Feast of the Annunciation is celebrated every year as Maryland Day. We may see this as Mary's hand in forming her own colony for the glory of American Christendom. This was not the first Mass ever celebrated in the continental United States. That distinction is found in Spanish Florida. But it was the first Mass celebrated in the 13 original colonies, dominated as they were by heretics who had left the faith. It was the year 1634 of the reign of Christ the King. Now, this was the Anglo founding of American Christendom. What about Quebec? Well, meanwhile, to the north, the French Catholic brethren of the Baltimores were building Canadian Christendom, extending through modern Canada, Michigan, down the Mississippi to the great Catholic civilization, New Orleans. Maryland and French Canada are the Anglo and French founding of Christendom in the Americas. But only one of these was condemned by the Declaration of Independence. And why is that? The reason is Catholic culture. At the Collegium, students have this amazing blessing, and they have this privilege to have this integrated formation in Catholic culture. So let's pause here. We're going to pause in this history for a minute, and we're going to talk about what is culture. As I discuss in my book, City of God versus City of Man, the great Catholic historian of the 20th century, Christopher Dawson, he breaks down the definition of culture into basically four main elements: cultus, tradition, elders, and piety. Every culture known to man until modern times has these four elements. The first is the most important: cultus. What is a cultus? A cultus is a religious ritual which provides contact with the divine. Everything in a culture flows from the cultus. St. Thomas says that the offering of sacrifice, the cultus, is part of natural law. Therefore, every culture, every civilization, every government that has ever existed has offered a public cultus. That is, a state-sponsored religious ritual to the divine in order to make contact with the gods. So we have the cultus, which makes contact with God. Obviously, the cultus of Catholic culture is the apostolic rite passed down from the apostles. As I said, at the Collegium, students have this immense blessing to have the Latin Mass, the Apostolic Roman Rite, as the cultus which forms their Catholic culture. Many Catholic colleges suffer from a lack of Eucharistic reverence itself, which leads to a lack of Catholic culture. Eucharistic reverence, however, is more than just the rite itself, but it's all the customs that surround and flow from the liturgy. And this brings us to our next element in culture, tradition. Because the cultus is, in a culture, rests on tradition, written and unwritten. The tradition is what explains the cultus. The word tradition is a verb which simply means to pass down. What is Catholic tradition, therefore? Everything that gets passed down, from the smallest and most obscure pious custom to the greatest pearl of great price in our tradition, the Latin Mass, or the Apostolic Roman Rites. Indeed, the Second Council of Nicaea, Ecumenical Council number 7, decreed that the lowest and least authoritative form of tradition, that is sacred art, quote, if anyone despises a church tradition, written or unwritten, let him be anathema, end quote. Therefore, in the broadest possible sense of the term, tradition, in the way we're using it here, all things passed down, would also include Scripture itself. Scripture is simply written tradition as opposed to oral tradition. The tradition explains the cultus, teaching the faithful to have Eucharistic reverence, which is what builds Catholic civilization. So from the cultus, mediated through tradition, divine grace and divine wisdom illuminate all things in Catholic culture: family life, political, economic life, all the rest, literature, sciences, music, visual art, architecture. Think, for example, the treasury of sacred music, all composed for the Holy Mass. Mozart, Beethoven, even the Lutheran Bach, or the immensity of Catholic architecture, all built to orient the heart to the reverence of the Blessed Sacrament. Now, in French Canada, this was the case. The Holy Mass is what built Quebec, built French Canada. The third and fourth elements of culture are simple: elders and piety. The elders are the ones who guard the cultus and teach the tradition to the next generation. Piety is the virtue by which the younger generation reveres the older generation in order to receive the cultus and the tradition. So there you have it. What is culture? A culture is a society which flows from the cultus, explained by tradition, passed down from the elders to the next generation by means of piety. The Catholic cultus is the Mass. The tradition is the whole of Christendom, which is centered on Eucharistic reverence, which is passed down by the elders, who are both priests and Catholic parents, to the younger generation, in the Collegium's case, that's the students, who receive it with reverence and piety. At the Collegium, students make the transition from the Catholic culture of the domestic church to the Catholic culture of the university, one of the central institutions of Christendom. So, having said all that, let's get back to Quebec and Maryland. First, the Catholic culture of Quebec was what we might call ordinary Christendom. That is the form of Catholic culture that had already begun spreading in Asia, Africa, and later Western Europe at that point. The government of Quebec paid public obeisance to the King of Kings by means of the cultus, the Latin Mass. Now we'll get into what happened with the Declaration of Independence. After the French-Indian Alliance lost the war to the British Indian Alliance in 1763, that's the so-called 7 Years' War, or French-Indian War, the Catholic culture of Canada came under the dominion of the Anglican King George III. Showing favor to the Catholic faith in a way quite remarkable in the history of the Anglican regime, the British Parliament passed the Quebec Act of 1774, which permitted French Catholicism to not only be freely practiced in the new English domains known as Canada, but that Eucharistic reverence could continue to govern society. In other words, the Catholics could continue running things in Canada as if Canada was a Catholic nation, since it already was and had been for more than 200 years at that point. The Quebec Act secured and protected state-sponsored, unapologetic Catholic culture in Canada. That is why the Declaration of Independence condemns the Quebec Act. It is one thing to have Catholicism tolerated as a private devotion of those backwards, superstitious papists. A private papist religion would still allow the culture to be Protestant or deist. It is totally different to have Catholicism define the society by means of culture. That would mean that the culture would be fully Catholic. So we have the reality that the Declaration of Independence literally condemns Catholic culture itself. So why did Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence, why did he sign this? Now, some Catholics say that the Carroll family of Maryland were not very pious, and the Carroll family were just liberal Americanists. There is some truth to that, especially since we have Daniel Carroll's name not only on the U.S. Constitution, but on the Masonic cornerstone ritual performed by George Washington in, quote, in the year of Masonry 5793, as the newspapers reported it. Despite this fact, there is concurrently another positive side that can be seen in the Carroll family and the Maryland Christendom, making the Collegium an important aspect of this history. You see, what happened in Maryland since Lord Baltimore was completely different than Quebec. Maryland had to create a new form of Christendom in order to pass down the faith. Catholic culture was in survival mode in Maryland, surrounded by heretics who wanted to destroy the Mass and kill papists. Catholics chose to love their enemies and to protect the non-Catholic Marylanders and promote the Holy Mass not by state sponsorship, but by the holiness of their own lives. Maryland was a different form of Catholic culture for the sake of survival, for passing down the faith. But going back to the founding of Maryland, shortly after Maryland's founding, the heretical Puritans seized the Catholic government of Maryland and passed laws to remove Catholics from any political power whatsoever. Thankfully, the heretics did not have the power to hunt down Catholics and kill them like they did in England. So they were forced to tolerate the Catholic Marylanders. The Catholics fought back and passed the Maryland Toleration Act, which did put to death non-Trinitarian heretics, but permitted Catholics and Protestants free exercise of each faith. But the heretics could not tolerate Catholic toleration. And after 1688, they were able to remove all Catholics from public office in Maryland. The Mass was illegal again, and Catholics were forced to celebrate the Latin Mass privately in homes. The free system of English laws was imposed on Maryland. Sound familiar? So, compared to Canada, the survival mode Catholic culture of Maryland had been greatly suppressed. True, the public cultus of the Latin Mass had never been truly public and political since Maryland Day at the Annunciation 1634, but removing Catholic governors and statesmen from Maryland truly relegated the cultus to a private devotion with very little influence on the surrounding Maryland society. At that time, despite the heretical takeover of Maryland, the Carroll family had managed to become the richest and most powerful family in Maryland by the time of the Revolution in 1776, and indeed of the whole 13 colonies. Now, what did they do with their wealth? They raised altars on their own land so that the holy sacrifice could at least be celebrated privately, keeping the remnant of Maryland's Christendom alive. This is the survival mode. If the Puritans or other Protestants came with a mob to threaten them, the Carroll family would meet them with a small army of their sons and slaves and put down their hubris with the musket. The Carroll family lived on 17,000 acres at Carroll Manor, just 41 miles northwest of D.C. So when the American Revolutionary War of Independence was breaking out in 1774, going back to the beginning of this whole story, the Carroll family must have seen an opportunity to reestablish the American Christendom of Maryland, and indeed these whole United States. If we can safely assume that some of the Carroll family were indeed liberal Americanists, we can also safely assume that some of them had real Catholic piety. They saw that the Patriots, led by George Washington, were willing to tolerate and even promote the Catholics if they contributed to the cause of independence. The Carroll family took action, and for the first time, these Catholic noblemen returned to government, forming the Annapolis Convention in 1774, which was Maryland declaring its own independence from the crown, even as the Philadelphia Continental Congress was condemning the Quebec Act. Maryland's Declaration of Independence happened in 1775, and it abolished those free system of English laws, which had hitherto prevented Catholics from holding political office in the state. So what happened next? By siding with the Patriots, the Carroll family was able to secure for these United States not only legalizing the Latin Mass again, but an intimate place for the faith in the American culture of these United States. The cousins of Charles Carroll were the aforementioned Daniel Carroll and John Carroll, the latter becoming the first bishop of the United States. As Providence had it, Pope Clement XIV suppressed the Jesuits, causing John Carroll to flee to Maryland in that same year of 1774, at the moment when Maryland was declaring that independence and removing those anti-Catholic laws. In that year, Father Carroll said the first Mass in his mother's home, but after the Revolution gave more influence to Catholic culture. This quickly became St. John's Parish in Silver Spring, Maryland, 8 miles north of D.C. Now, you remember Maryland Day when Father Andrew White celebrated the Annunciation. John Carroll was able to reestablish this mission site as St. Ignatius Parish in Port Tobacco, Maryland. And in the same year as that Masonic ritual with Daniel Carroll and George Washington, out of Maryland, Mary had her own plans. Bishop John Carroll dedicated in that same year these United States to the Immaculate Conception in the year 1793 of the reign of Christ the King. This is when Maryland, the land of Mary, extended to these United States. Henceforth, America was the land of the Immaculate Conception, and hence the national shrine. What happened with Quebec? The Carroll family actually traveled to Quebec and attempted to win over the French Catholics there to their cause, but unfortunately, Bishop Brion of Quebec had read the anti-Catholic pronouncements of the Patriots and issued an excommunication against Father John Carroll, which meant that he had to travel back over the Atlantic to receive his episcopal consecration after American independence. Now, in a twist of providence, the Catholic kings of France and Spain, because they sided with the Patriots were forced to favor the church, which allowed the Spanish king to finance a Catholic church in New York City, the historic St. Peter's Church. Because the Carroll family sided with the Patriots, Bishop John was able to begin construction not only on new public churches, but the first Catholic university among the heretical English for centuries, Georgetown University, 1791. This institution greatly expanded Catholic culture, passing down the faith in these United States. Because they sided with the Revolution, the Carroll family helped form Maryland and indeed American culture American Catholic culture in these United States, leading to the traditional Catholic See of Baltimore, and perhaps you've heard of the Baltimore Catechism. In this way, Maryland Christendom became the mustard seed for American Christendom. This is not the French Christendom of Canada, but an Anglo-Christendom which formed a unique Catholic culture here. Because of the Catholic Carroll family's efforts to restore Catholics to political office and the freedom to build churches and universities in the United States, Catholics have been able to gradually influence the American Protestant culture more and more for the true faith. This reached its climax in the interwar period of the 20th century, when Catholics led a cultural movement against Hollywood pornography in the 1930s, known as the Legion of Decency, and eventually won the presidency itself in John F. Kennedy. But since 1776, there's always been this tension in American Catholicism. Some Catholics have sought to establish the fullness of Catholic culture, the Catholic cultus informing the whole society, like French Canadian Catholicism or the Legion of Decency. But others, like Cardinal James Gibbons or John F. Kennedy, have sought not to make America more Catholic, but to make Catholicism more American. This is liberal Catholicism. And this may be a result of the divided nature of the Carroll family itself from the beginning. To make a long, sorry story short, in the 1960s, liberal Catholicism gained the dominant influence. The centerpiece of this effort was to reverse Catholic culture itself. Instead of transforming the society by means of the cultus, the liberals have transformed the cultus by means of the society. They have not tried to subordinate society to the Latin Mass, but make the Mass more subordinate to modern society. They have tried to abolish the Latin Mass again, just like the free system of English laws formerly in Maryland. Following Cardinal James Gibbons, they used the history of Maryland Christendom to argue against French Christendom as somehow backwards or immoral. The truth is that French Canadian and Maryland Christendom were two forms of the same Catholic culture, formed by one Latin Mass. Both had the four elements: cultus, tradition, elders, and piety. But one was French with a Catholic majority. The other was Anglo with a Catholic minority. What the liberal wing of American Catholicism wants to do is make French and Maryland Christendoms into enemies and repeat that condemnation of Catholicism by the Continental Congress we first quoted. Instead, what the Collegium gives students is the experience of an integrated Catholic culture in the Catholic state of Maryland, which is completely opposed to liberal Catholicism. It is at the Collegium where the elders of Catholic culture pass down to students the tradition, informed by the cultus, which is received with piety. Incoming students have tasted that Catholic culture of the domestic church, and now they come to the Catholic Maryland to taste this Christendom, built and passed down to us from our French and Anglo forefathers, so that by this formation, directly from the ancient Catholic cultus, they can go back to their own communities to build Christendom there. And this is what Maryland has done for American Catholicism since its founding. It is the Anglo mustard seed of Catholic culture here. The Collegium is what integrates Maryland Christendom into the whole of Catholic cultural history by means of the Latin Mass. And that is why the land of Mary, Maryland, matters for American Christendom, and why the Collegium matters for Maryland. Thank you.
15 years ago, Pope Benedict declared an educational emergency and called on the church to rescue our young people from radical ideologies and to provide them a truthful, faithful Catholic education. I'm going to read from his statement. He said, "Parents," he said, "anxious and often anguished about the future of their children are asking for it. A great many teachers going through the sorrowful experience of their school's deterioration are asking for it. Society overall, seeing doubts cast on the very foundations of coexistence, is asking for it. And children and young people themselves, who do not want to be left to face life's challenges on their own are also asking for it in their inmost being, unquote. Tragically, the truth is that most Catholic colleges in the United States have rejected this call. Instead, they've chosen to compromise the faith and embrace false ideology. But Dr. Ed Schaefer and his team have responded admirably and enthusiastically to the call of Pope Benedict. After the Cardinal Newman Society reviewed the Collegium's innovative program, unique and impressive curriculum, faithful policies, and exciting vision, we were thrilled to include the Collegium among the 25 colleges that are recognized in the Newman Guide for Faithful Catholic Education. While most of private education is struggling today, I'm happy to say that most of the Newman Guide colleges are breaking their enrollment records every year, and I have that same hope for the Collegium. So I'm grateful to celebrate with you here tonight, and I hope that everyone here takes the time to visit the Collegium. I strongly encourage you to do that, and see what I have seen of exciting, vibrant, innovative, faithful Catholic college, and a great gift to the church. And on behalf of Catholic families, I'd just like to thank you. Where did he go? I'd like to thank you, Dr. Schaefer, and your entire team. I think you guys are heroes for standing up and doing something that's very difficult, but extremely important. And thank you for taking up the call to be a leader in faithful Catholic education. All right, thank you.